Welcome to the first ever Creative Connect video in the Creative Connects video series. In this series, I'll be interviewing various artists from across the globe about their journey into artistry, funding, and things that my viewers, aka you, can do to up their creative game. If you're interested in being featured on this series, drop me a DM. Shout out to British Council for funding this series. Our first ever episode is being kicked off by the amazing Mustafa, who's the Arts Programme Manager for British Council in Egypt. In this video, we explore his journey into the arts, best tips for creatives, accountability, and accessing the arts within Egypt. On top of this, we have a little sprinkle of discussion about dismantling systems and making systems that equally represent us all. Hey Mustafa, how are you doing?
Hello. I'm good, how are you?
Yeah, I'm good, thank you. Firstly, I'd like to say thank you for joining the call. But for everyone who doesn't know what you do you mind explaining a bit about who you are and what you do for a job?
Sure. Thank you very much for the invitation first. And this is Mustafa. I'm the Arts Program Manager for the British Council in Egypt. And through this job, I'm overseeing the arts, culture, and antiquities portfolio for the Council in Egypt, working with the sector here on building partnerships and connections with the UK through showcasing different works from the UK and Egypt and vice versa, but also through identifying potential exchange opportunities and learning opportunities between the sector in the UK and Egypt. And for now, since the beginning of the COVID-19, I would be reluctant about calling it crisis now. I started taking a regional approach, more of a regional approach for my job. And I've been working with a small group in the council on working on a regional scale, delivering activities and collating different resources on a regional scale.
Thank you. So obviously what you do is a lot and it's really, really impressive. And the first question that I'm kind of interested in is, how did you get into the current role that you're in?
So I started working around arts and culture 10 years ago. Specifically working, it was exactly 10 years ago. Before that, I was volunteering in different organizations and taking different roles. I've been since I was really young. I remember wanting to be very, very closely related to arts and culture ever since I was a kid. And growing up in Egypt, there was a problem. I had it was a challenge. I would say that I couldn't identify after high school a program, a study program, a university program that teaches cultural management. And it was by then that I started building my life in a different way, because I had an interest in economy. I had an interest in social sciences, and I realized that the added value that I could have would be the intersectionality between social sciences and creativity and management. Using high-tech management approaches to deliver art and cultural sectors that are functional and sustainable. So I studied management. I studied business administration and accounting, minor accounting, major business administration. And meanwhile, I had in 2011, by the end of 2011, and it was right after the Egyptian revolution has erupted, I started working with a small group of friends on a very, very small site-specific cultural center that we created as in response to a very, very centralized arts and cultural scene in Alexandria, my hometown by then. And the point was to not wait for people to come to the city center where all the arts activities are and so on, but to go in residential areas and create small hubs of intellect, of discussions, of questions, of film screenings and book discussions and so on, and film screenings for kids and for an open dialogue, because it was the only thing that we could do by then, and it was the main thing that we were lacking by then, and that's why 2011 happened. And as things started moving gradually, I started also developing approaches of strategy to what I'm doing. And that's why I first worked on different projects related to accessibility to arts and culture, to equal representation in arts and culture, and that's when I started engaging also with gender issues and gender representation in art. And the thing was, open source was always also a key element for me. If we are not equally, if we don't have equal opportunities to access knowledge, to access information, then our attempt to everything is not equal. And that was also a key factor for me. I guess that possibly answers your question.
Yeah, yeah, definitely it does. And I think it's really cool because I'm seeing more and more over in Birmingham, over in Coventry, that arts is essentially being decentralised. So instead of having all the kind of arts programming in the city centre, people are starting to actually go into the communities, and you know, we're seeing a massive impact and a massive shift on kind of how communities are viewing art, and they're understanding it's about their voice, it's about, you know, making an equal playing field. And something that I'm interested in is what has been the effect on the communities over in Egypt that have been introduced to art as a conversation starter when they'd never actually seen that programming before.
Well, it's a completely different case nowadays than what we're talking about. What you're talking about was what happened in Egypt between 2011 and 2014, let's say, which is when the context was open, when people had way more access to public spheres and to public venues and so on. And it was very different. I mean, Egypt had a lot of site-specific art activities by then. You could see public festivals, like street art festivals happening, and people engaging with them, and people supporting them. Because also a huge part of it was Egypt. The weather in Egypt is very, very relatively good most of the year, so it's also a lot of access to public elements. And a lot of ownership on the streets. And the main factor was when this became a little bit risky for the different political involved parties. And you can say that starting end of 2013, early 2014, this element of art movement or intellectual movement or cultural movement was the victim of that, let's say, because it was the easiest, most fragile cycle. And that's why I'm really interested nowadays in studying cultural policies, because we did not really, between 2011 and 2013, we did not work on cultural policy. So we did not have a framework to protect all the achievements that were achieved between 2011 and 2013. And that's why we need to have our support of cultural policy, our plan on that, to be able to support every other achievement that we acquire in the coming future. But again, going back to your question, it was really, really, really appreciated and perceived so well by the people, by the crowds, by the communities, by the smaller communities that didn't have access to those kind of activities or information or communication before. And it ran on for a long time. People were actually involved in trying to find solutions. People were involved in trying to make things happen until the very last moment, and until things stopped. Until it stopped being possible, basically. But until the last moment, people were involved. People were active participants in trying to find solutions.
Thank you. And something else which I kind of want to draw out, just because we're not too aware of it as young people within the UK, cultural policies and the fact that our cultural policies. And I was wondering if you could explain a bit about how cultural policies has impacted the arts within Egypt.
Well, I can tell you about that in a little bit of a shifted way. It's basically the lack of cultural policy and how it impacted the art scene in Egypt. So, for example, why do we need cultural policy at the first place? I think that's the most important question. Why do we need it? Not why do we not need it? And it's basically because for every process, for every system, you introduce a system, but you introduce a mechanism for it to be functional.
Mhm.
And cultural policy is the functionality of the process. Cultural policy is an organizing element that guarantees that this process is functional, works, and is fair, and is ceases to develop.
Mhm.
Uh, and this can only happen through open access for people to deliver what they want to deliver
Mhm.
under a certain level of protectiveness of everybody who would not appreciate what is being delivered, and an equal identification of all the involved parties and their distance from each other and from the product. So is the state involved? Is the state responsible? Are the people involved? Are the people responsible? Are the communities involved? Are they responsible? What did they put in and what do they take out? And accordingly, this a cultural sector that has clear policies is capable of becoming an industry. Without cultural policy, cultural sectors cannot become cultural industries.
Mhm. Would you say right now there's a cultural industry in Egypt then?
I would say there are impressive attempts to survive.
Okay. Thank you. And so if you or when you want to change cultural policy in Egypt, what do you have to do? Like, what are the lengths?
Uh, I think that's more or less $1 million question. I don't. I think I'm actually in the process of trying to work and study on more on cultural policy, and it's for me an interesting question to dig a little bit about uh, on how was the introduction of cultural policy in the UK. I was actually studying the UK as an example, as a model to learn from on that. Uh, even though I have my personal criticism about all cultural policy in the UK, there are things that are that need a lot of questioning and criticism. But finally, this attempt of creating an environment which is a closed cycle, which allows people to feel protected producing what they're producing, and protected economically producing what they're producing, and protected uh, on the element of thought and intellect. And accordingly be able to participate with it in different networks and in different cycles. This is an example of a sector. Otherwise, it's not.
Yeah, that makes sense. And again, it's a it's an interesting one because, like, obviously I work in the arts and culture sector within the UK, but have rarely heard the word cultural policy.
Yeah.
And I haven't seen it challenged. I don't even really understand what our cultural policy is because I haven't looked into it. So obviously, because you've looked into the UK cultural policy, and you kind of know a bit about what's good about it and what's bad about it, do you mind kind of overviewing UK cultural policy?
Well, I think, for example, the main framework that is currently guiding the cultural policy in the UK would be creative economy
Mm.
as a representation of an attempt to organize creative industries into an economy, into an environment. And this is happening only through identifying on an economical scale, on a management scale, what are the opportunities offered through the cultural sector. So historically, cultural sectors were facing a problem where they needed to be supported by states.
Mm-hmm.
And this was the stereotype that culture is costly. And that's why all through after the Second World War, this was the trick. Culture is costly, and governments cannot afford sustaining culture. And it was then a matter of economic separationism. So wealthy states could afford, while non-wealthy states could not, and so on. What was different was trying to look at it from a different perspective, trying to understand that there is an opportunity cost here, and this opportunity cost can generate.
Mm-hmm.
It is a generating mechanism. So, for example, one of the very interesting parts is how the UK is supporting filmmaking industry, for example.
Yeah.
And from the region, there's also another interesting example, which is Morocco nowadays here. Morocco is allowing people to come and shoot their films offering a lot of support on logistical elements, offering a lot of support on the research. So they're making it happen. And accordingly, charging people for that, but also guaranteeing a lot of tourism as a result of that, and having a lot of job opportunities, creating markets, creating industry, smaller industry, micro industries that together form a bigger industry, which might be struggling nowadays. I mean, like everything else, that's another question. And how is the the creative economy capable of surviving COVID-19? That's another question for another discussion. But at least it's capable to survive. It's capable to be there and do it in that element. And that's an example of a cultural creative economy adopting cultural policy and like establishing a structure, establishing a mechanism that is functional. A huge share of the income of DCMS in the UK is from cultural industries.
Yeah. And I think, thank you for that. And I think something that we're kind of seeing a massive shift towards over here is social enterprises.
Yep.
So, of course, we all know that government funding and state funding is not reliable and never will be a reliable source of income for the arts and culture sector. So I'm seeing a lot of different organisations who want to do amazing work. For example, like the Maya Group, you know, Beat Freaks, actually start up as social enterprises and say, okay, so what we're going to do is, instead of just, again, relying off state funding, relying off government funding, we're going to make our arts a package and a product, and we're going to actually offer this to the public, offer this to clients. And then in that way, it means that there's a lot more resilience within the arts and culture sector, within the Midlands at this current moment.
Definitely, yes, definitely. I mean, it guarantees a lot more offering, and accordingly, it guarantees a lot more competition in a different way, but it also guarantees a lot more participatory approaches, and accordingly, also a lot more opportunities.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the opportunity cost of that.
I think another thing which is kind of coming out of it is accountability. And because the public are now directly funding or paying for services in the arts, they're able to be a lot more accountable and actually hold these art organisations to account. And something that I'm quite interested in, because obviously knowing you as a person, I was about to call you a trailblazer. I don't think I said that right anyway. Is it a trailblazer?
Sorry?
Is it a trailblazer or is it a trailblazer?
Is it a what?
A trailblazer? Yeah, so what I'm quite interested in asking you, just from kind of knowing you as a person, I know that you're someone who knows to stand up for themselves, and when you see something that's wrong, I've seen you before, like you know how to verbalise that and you know how to actually get a solution. And I'm really interested, because of course you work in the arts and culture sector in Egypt. How do you kind of approach challenging people and holding people accountable? And what's the methods that you normally use for that?
I think that's an interesting question, actually. It's something between calling a spade,
Mm-hmm.
but calling it an interesting spade.
Okay.
So yeah, I don't think there's a textbook answer for that. I think it's very important to, and that's why I'm interested in open source information, open access to knowledge, because it's only through knowledge that you are capable of identifying your position from things. And once you're capable of identifying your position in a very, very frank and honest way, you will be able to call a spade a spade. You will be able to know what's right and what's wrong.
Mm-hmm.
It's through communication. If we agreed that we're having this interview at this time and in this framework, then we're having it in this framework, and then there's something that I can hold you accountable for, and there's something that you can help hold me accountable for. And it's through this clarity, through this understanding, and that's why I'm very fond of the process that's happening now in the UK, because it's only through the transparency of the transition of funds, of the circulation of the cash flow, that the public is capable of holding the organizations accountable.
Mm-hmm.
Because so you stated that this is your vision, you stated that this is your mission. How are you adhering to that? How are you achieving that? How are you delivering that?
Definitely. And I think there is something in the fact that knowledge is power. And if you want to dismantle a system, you have to know what built up the system in the first place and what part you play in that system.
And you
Okay.
have to also understand that it's very, very risky that sometimes trying to understand it, you don't get sucked into it. Because that's also very, very important.
Yeah, you see a lot of the time people will start off as, to put it lightly, you know, the people who are like, F the system, I hate the system. And I feel like I've kind of fallen into this myself. Oh, motorbike. But
I
anyway.
like motorbikes.
There's often you see patterns of people who start off as like really against the system and they're like, F the system, I don't agree with it, I don't want to work for it. And as they start researching more into it and they start kind of trying to dismantle it, they end up becoming a part of it. And again, I think I'm one of those people that kind of started off very against the arts and culture sector within the UK and then has accidentally kind of fell in love with parts of it.
Yeah. But then again, I mean, the question is, why do we have systems? We have systems to use systems.
Yeah.
So we don't have, if we don't really use them, if we don't manage to use them properly, then we don't have to have them. And accordingly, the trick is to find the best usability to that system. And accordingly, to find the best accountability within it, to find the best deliverability within it. It needs to be functional, it needs to be efficient. So systems are not there to bind us, systems are there to help us. And we're here not to break them, we're here to use them.
Yeah, so it's more about going into a system and shifting its view and shifting who it serves. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, exactly. Because well, yes, why I'm not interested in having everybody fighting their systems.
Mm-hmm.
That's not the point. But the point is, I'm interested in everybody making sure the systems are efficient, the systems are equitable.
Yeah,
That's what we need to be working on.
definitely. And I think that's a massive learning lesson that goes across the board. Like, obviously, again, as people who want to make change and want equality and want, you know, all of these amazing things, it is about finding the ways in which we can make that happen without being counterproductive and without kind of burning down the things that are actually currently open for us.
Yeah, exactly. And understanding exactly our position from those things. Because again, I mean, there's a huge difference between holding things accountable and destructing them. Sometimes it is important not to engage with things anymore. Mm-hmm. But this element of, because usually those things are empowered by systems, and that's why people sometimes are so angry at systems, because sometimes systems, if they are not equal and fair, they serve as opportunities for unequal and unfair treatments. But the thing is, finally, systems are tools. Yeah. They are introduced to be tools to support people through their pathway in life. And they should not be putting people through horrible times or torturing people or making their lives hard. They should be making our lives easier. Yeah. And that goes for every system.
Thank you. And obviously we've said a lot about positions, the positions that we have. So I was wondering if at this current moment you were asked by a girl on Zoom what your current position is in the arts and culture sector, what would your response be?
My position towards what? Or about what?
Your position, what part do you have to play in the system at this current moment?
I think my what I'm trying to hold to nowadays, that's because that's also very relevant to something that I'm working on. Is not to try to make up solutions, is to try to create the space for solutions to be identified. Mm-hmm. because is to create opportunities for people who are engaging with arts and culture across Egypt or across the region to come together and speak about how and why and how they want things to be as they want them to be, and accordingly create processes to make them achieve what they want, rather than telling them that this is what you should be doing or this is what you should be doing or the way out of this is blah blah blah. There's no identifiable right channel, but there is an identifiable goal that we can all agree on, be it whatever it is, and design a route for it.
So
and I think this is where I should be.
Definitely. I was just about to say, so you're essentially an enabler. You're someone that kind of comes into a community, a space, a group, and you help.
I'd say a strategist more than an enabler.
Oh, what? Sorry.
A strategist more than an enabler.
Yeah.
Because enabling goes both ways, but strategy doesn't. Or maybe it does. Maybe it does actually. But the thing is, if you have an open strategy, it will be automatically enabling. It will grant everybody the opportunity to flourish, and then you will enable throughout the process. Within the process, you will be enabling different elements. But I'm really keen on having a strategy to open information and open access of knowledge.
Thank you. So it's essentially strategy is more inclusive than enabling.
Yeah. It's not more inclusive. It makes enabling easier.
Okay. Yeah, I get you.
It designs the framework that makes enabling easier.
Yeah.
It makes things more attainable, let's say.
You're genuinely like a walk-in, I was about to say a walk-in history book, but this isn't just history. This is like, you're just like a walk-in fountain of knowledge.
It's not really, no, yeah, well, thank you first. I really appreciate that. I'm usually, I get shy in front of, like, around those comments, and whenever I am, I sometimes mumble around and don't know what to say. But yeah, I remember when I was 5 years old, I wanted to become an encyclopedia, not a doctor, not a policeman, not a politician, an encyclopedia, and this means that basically for me. Yeah, it's only, there's only one possible way to live all happy and equal, and it's basically living happy and equal. There's only one route to happiness, which is happiness. And accordingly, there's only one way to equality, which is equality. There's only one way to representation, equal fair representation, and it's through equal fair representation.
I love that, and I really do believe that you have become a literal human encyclopedia.
Thank you.
But no, that's brilliant. Like, again, it's like, I think when people hear strategy, they get taken back and they think it's got to be huge and complex and you've got to be a scholar to strategize. But it's like, no, you've just got to know what you're trying to strategize about and know it well enough so that, again, you can be inclusive and that you can create change and bring joy and create the shifts that we really want to see.
I definitely agree, and I think it also makes sense, because that's again the question about systems. Because sometimes systems are complicated, sometimes strategies are complicated. I mean, strategies for complicated matters need to be complicated. That's a fact. But it's also a matter of, is it a burden or a complication? It doesn't need to be a burden. It should not be a burden. It could be a complication. It could be a complication for those who are interested in it to get involved. It's an open door policy. Walk in. If you're interested in strategy, if you're interested in arts and culture, you'll be able to know what could you be doing to support the arts and culture sector in the UK, for example. But is it too complicated? No, it's not too complicated, and that's the point. That's the trick. If you make it too complicated and accordingly non-participatory, it stops being representative of people, and accordingly it loses its value.
What would make a strategy too complicated?
The lack of representation.
Okay.
I think it's always about representation. People will go in rounds and rounds and rounds through history, and it's finally about representation. It's finally about what people represent and who are allowed to be represented. And that's throughout history, throughout all forms of conflict.
Definitely. And if there was, so for example, a 16-year-old and they want to get into the arts and culture industry and they feel unrepresented, what would you say would be the utmost first step for them to start making that change and making that jump?
I would say first a proper dive through the internet. And that's why I personally really appreciate the internet. And when I say I appreciate the internet, I'm saying I appreciate the internet versus not having the internet. And I'm speaking about 20 years ago. Yes, I'm speaking about 20 years ago. It's not really far. Like 20 years ago is not a huge time in history.
Yeah.
And that's why it's a very important lesson on representation. That's why the internet is revolutionary, because it allows us a much better representation opportunity. And accordingly, it is through understanding about what you are interested in. If you're 16 years old, who is interested in origami,
Mm-hmm.
for example, you wouldn't be able to start working around origami or papier-mâché or whatever, for example, because those are things that are not equally represented, let's say now. Unless you understand who else is doing that and how and where did it come from, and accordingly, where is it on the planet, who can support, who did what are the successful models, what are not. A little bit of literature research about the situation across everywhere. And accordingly move from there. You will know that you are not alone. You will know that other people are working on that or try to and face that, or try to or didn't work, but maybe you have the solution for that. And that's the element of representation. If you have equal, fair access to information and an opportunity for representation, an opportunity for you to create whatever you want. And that's why I really appreciate the work that you're doing in these fields, because it grants those amazing participants that work with beat freaks, and that's what I learned from your website, to create what they want to create, be it, and then understand if it's still interesting for them or not, if they still want to engage with it or not, if it's going to become something else or not. It's a process of self-discovery that leaves people in a better position about this factor, this topic, but also about themselves, because they're capable.
Yeah. And I think as well, if you're trying to build a career up and you have no reference points, and you have, like you were saying, if you want to be someone that does an origami maker, but you know it's not a profitable business, but you've never seen someone be profitable and live off it, then you don't have a framework to work within. You don't have a reference on how to thrive in that industry.
And that's why strategy is very important, as I mentioned, because strategy teaches you to be able to deconstruct things and to know that, well, there is no form for origami making to be profitable right now, but 50 years ago there was no form for music industries to be profitable unless people attend live concerts. Yeah. And that's why people needed to create different things, and so on and so forth. It is the element of trying to adopt best practices from different forms, from different industries, from different attempts. We are all thinking, finally, it's all about knowledge and it's all about best practice. It's about understanding finding a way to do things.
Definitely. And what I've noticed is, like, when people are seeking out knowledge, when people want to learn, they end up coming across like-minded individuals, and then from there they build their networks. And with networks, you know, the larger your network is, the more you're going to be aware of appropriate grants, appropriate funding, opportunities, because you've got kind of more ears to the ground. And I think with my own journey, even though at the time I didn't recognize that when I was 16 years old, trying to get into the arts, I didn't know that I was actually actively seeking knowledge and actively building networks. But in retrospect, it's like, wow, that's what I did, and that's what many other people in the arts and culture sector, majority of the time, that's how they started.
Yeah, and that's, it's basically, this is why we need strategy again, identifying what is the process. How do we build knowledge? How do we build participation? How do we become field experts? And remember when I told you at the beginning of the interview, that 12 years ago there was no arts and cultural management program, university program in Egypt, and that was the question: how do I become a field expert if I don't have an opportunity to learn that on academic scale?
Yeah.
And it's through identifying best practices, through supporting people trying to do those things, and learning throughout this process of support, learning why and where did it fail, or why was it challenged, where was the cycle weak, where did it break?
Yeah, and
trying to find solutions for it, and that's
I suppose finding the solutions and shadowing people and finding best practices probably the biggest part of gaining knowledge. But something which I'm quite intrigued about is, obviously over the years you've accumulated loads of knowledge and you've worked with a lot of different people, but where do you actually store all this knowledge? Do you have methods to keep in, records of best practice, etc., or do you just kind of keep it in your head like an encyclopedia?
That's I've been thinking a lot through the lockdown about this question, and I think it's so far it's still locked in, relatively, but also it is around. I mean, it is shared. It is it is included in every program that I designed over the past years. It is included in every program that I was a consultant on in the past years. It is important to know that to be able to succeed, you need to be edgy in your thoughts, in the way you think and present your thoughts. And accordingly, I'm interested in trying to work with people who are trying to find solutions to things like that, to be able to implement those mechanisms and strategies, to be able to think differently and perceive differently. And because I believe it's not about the knowledge that is, it's not about creating a Wikipedia page, or writing a book. It's about, there is a lot of details and the process on how to do it, but there's a whole mechanism. It's about the openness. It's about the capacity to not judge the process initially, the capacity to leave things happen, and then based on the happening, know what happened.
Yeah. So I suppose your work, and this goes for everyone, your work is a track record of your knowledge, because what you...
I believe everybody's work should be a track record of their knowledge. It should be representative of that, and maybe that's why I'm always I find it very weird when people are actually actively doing jobs that they hate. I mean, I can understand if someone doesn't like the job, but hate the job, that's really complicated, because if you wouldn't be able to create, to design, to achieve if you don't like it, because it is a process it's a process that needs to be immersed in it. You need to be a part of the process to be able to design something out of it.
And I suppose, I'm not sure if you've seen Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It's like a triangle.
Yeah, sure, yeah.
And essentially, the whole theory, for anyone who doesn't know, is that to reach creativity and to reach essentially creating innovation, you have to go through the different stages. And at the bottom is safety. And that is, the thing which they say, if you do not feel safe, you cannot create. And it's like, I don't know if there's a correlation between people feeling underrepresented, therefore not safe within the arts and culture scene, and then not being able to mobilize themselves or feel like they can mobilize themselves within this industry.
Very true. Very, very true. And it's about representation. It's about all the different levels of safety, because safety is a very, very vast expression, vast word.
Yeah.
Some people just correlate it to economical safety or physical safety or whatever, but it's a very, very broad expression.
Yeah.
Safety. It's not this or that. And for people to be able to create, do people only create when they feel safe? I'm not very sure.
Yeah.
I'm not very sure. But do people deserve to be safe? That's unquestionable.
Mm-hmm.
And accordingly, what I'm personally interested in is for everybody to feel equally capable, and accordingly for everybody to feel safe.
Definitely.
And accordingly create. Then people will be able to create, people will be able to design, people will be able to enjoy, people will be able to invent, people will be able to achieve. But first people need to feel safe. Yes. They will still create and achieve and break borders and so on if they don't feel safe. Because pressure, yes, it does sometimes lead
Yeah.
to explosion.
Yeah, definitely. And you see it a lot with artists who, instead of actually stand back, they react. And that's normally where the best and most innovative systems come from, where people have said, okay, this isn't for me and I don't feel safe here, but I'm
Those
gonna,
are the methods
I'm
that
gonna
zero.
react. Obviously, the best systems, and I think the newest systems come out when people don't feel safe and they react, and they start creating new structures more often than not for their community to operate within and feel safe within. And I think it is a thing where often people don't realize that they're creating new systems and new structures when they are. And it's
Yeah.
maybe later within, you know, the development phases, or when things are starting to see productive change, that's when they realize, wow, like I've built a whole structure, I've built a whole system, and I've actually created the kind of change that they needed to see to become safe.
Yeah, I find that a very, very sensible process. It makes all the sense, because creation is a response to need. You have to need it to create it. And uh, it's interesting because people always expect people to create things for them, whereas when you reach a process that you need something, you will create it for yourself. And that's the thing. You need to spend time on things, understanding what exactly they need from them to be able to create them. And
Definitely.
accordingly, you will be creating what you need exactly, very specifically. Active participation in the creation is key, because you will be using this, you will be participating in it, you will be attending to it. So creating cultural policy, for example, in the UK is something that you, Chloe, need to be participating in, because it is organizing your life.
Yeah, definitely. Wow, that is actually so true. And what I really hope people gain from this is the fact that, like, the key things that's really stood out from this conversation is about knowledge and about structures and systems. And I hope that across the board, you know, people who watch this from Egypt, people who watch it from the UK, realize that it's not a monotone system. You can change it and adapt it for yourself, and that's what needs to happen.
Yeah, exactly. And that the main point about this is a system to serve you, not a system to direct you or to limit you or to lead you. The system is there to serve you.
Definitely.
Should be there to serve you.
Thank you. So,
Thank you. Thank you very much for this.
thank you, Mustafa. I think everything that you said on this whole call was so interesting and really valuable. So have you got any words for the road?
Well, I mean, with all what's going on all around the globe and such critical moments, I would only say that fair representation is the only route for equality, and equality is the only process for progression. That's the only way out. We need to be equally represented and fair.
Thank you. You heard it here first. Well, you definitely didn't hear it here first, but equal representation is the way forward. So thank you for that, Mustafa. I hope you have a really good day. And again, I really appreciate you jumping on the call today.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the opportunity, and all my best wishes for this series to be as amazing as it is. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you for watching this video. Make sure you subscribe. We've got some uber interesting creatives coming up next, and this series will be running until the foreseeable future. You can find me on Instagram at @chloepappy_, or you can find me on Twitter at @chloedeacon_. Make sure you drop me a DM if you'd like to be featured on this series, and stay safe, people.